Over to Lynne.
Quite a bit of my biog has been missed out, but I'll fill you in as we go along. What I'm going to talk about is men's strategies to...
Oh, switch it on and off and on again.
That's it. Now up. It should be on.
Yeah. Can you hear me? No.
I'll turn it up. Just keep talking.
I'm from the revolutionary feminist branch of radical feminism, and we believe, and we have believed, that it's important to study male behaviour and to look at what men are doing in order to better counteract what they're doing. We've seen that this morning in looking at men who use women in prostitution. I'm just going to talk about briefly, because I haven't been left with much time, but I'm just going to be talking briefly about 15 minutes. Oh God.
That's what I thought you were expecting.
Yeah. Well, I might be a bit longer. Two movements which I think can be defined as men's rights movements. One is the fathers' rights movement, and the other is the trans movement, and I think they can both be defined as men's rights movements. The fathers' rights movements began in the 1970s, basically to challenge women's what women were doing in terms of fighting domestic violence. In the 1970s, there were laws which were beginning to allow women to leave violent men. For example, divorce laws were much easier. Also, women had been made equal guardians of their children, which before that, fathers were the guardians of their children, and so on. And quite a lot of women began leaving violent men and going to refuges, because it was also the start of the refuge movement. Families Meet Fathers was created as a response to this. And they formed groups, local groups in different areas of the country. And at the initially first government committee on violence in marriage, they threatened further violence and even murder if they weren't allowed contact with their children. Later they changed this strategy, and this has had an actual huge influence on changes to family law and family law practice in the context of domestic violence. They involve what Mary Daly has described as patriarchal reversal. That is taking feminist arguments about male power and turning them around. So they redefine themselves as the victims of women who are the real violent and dominating force in families. Those who've worked in domestic violence call the poor men syndrome. And the poor men ideology stretches across anything that as feminists we try to do, and it's in neoliberal feminism and elsewhere. Let's feel sorry for men because they are actual victims of women. Women are liars who exaggerate men's violence for their own ends. Women who experience domestic violence are deliberately manipulating children to not want contact with violent fathers on separation. This became known as parental alienation syndrome in the family courts, and it was only ever used against women. It was never used against men. Men didn't alienate their children. And then, to top it all, violent fathers are in reality grief-stricken, caring dads. Their violence towards mothers has nothing to do with their love for and care of children. So separating their behaviour out, if you like, violent perpetrators has nothing to do with being fathers. And fathers' presence in children's lives is primary to children's well-being and development. Thus, fathers' rights and children's rights are now seen as inseparable. Mothers' child rearing doesn't count, of course. Mothers become irrelevant in this discourse. They also did a lot of influencing behind the scenes. They worked tirelessly at local as national level, for example, in getting themselves on local family justice councils to influence and change family law policy. And they eventually got themselves represented on the powerful Parliamentary Family Law Committee. And like other men's groups, they've received massive amounts of funding from institutions like the UN to promote their aims. They're still operating, they still receive massive amount of funding. And they have kept at it for a period of over 30 years. I mean, one key aspect about men's rights movements is that they do not give up. They carry on. The impact for women has been that this ideological message has actually totally influenced government policy. So they've changed actual family law policy so that it is now virtually impossible for mothers and their children to escape violent abusers. And this is despite massive amounts of feminist research in this area demonstrating the harms of these policies. So, I mean, I know there are other things that are also affecting practice in terms of defending women who experience domestic violence, but the bottom line is that men continue to murder women and children in the post-separation context, and it's a means of revenge on the women for leaving them, and that is going on right now. Moving on to transgenderism as a men's rights movement, I just want to say a bit about Janice Raymond and the early warning she gave to us about what was happening, and then which we forgot, or some of us forgot it, till it was too late, really. Janice Raymond, in her book The Transsexual Empire, published in 1979, was one of the first to highlight the intentions of transsexualism, the growing phenomena of transsexualism, and of male transsexuals, with the ideology of gender identity and being born in the wrong body. She pointed out that it reinforces sex role stereotypes rather than actually challenging the social construction, for example, of femininity. Its aim was to colonise women's bodies and to increase the sexual control of women. And this was also related to the fact that during the late 1970s in the States, and to a certain extent, much smaller extent here, men impersonating women were calling themselves lesbian feminists, and were demanding their entry into lesbian feminist conferences and cultural events like the Michigan Women's Festival. And at that time, women were split down the middle about allowing them in. Some of them thought that they'd made the ultimate sacrifice by having their balls cut off. Others didn't. And she noted that even if they had had their balls cut off, they were still intent on sexually abusing women through voyeurism and through having access to lesbian bodies, because lesbians have been, if you like, the only group that have denied access, have denied male access to their bodies through being lesbians. She stated that they want to make women's bodies obsolete through the man-made she-male. And this was confirmed with her through her interviews with those men who already saw themselves as superior to women. Female to male transsexuals, on the other hand, was a means of neutralising and assimilating women into male culture. And we can now see this with all the young lesbians who are being pressurised, coerced into becoming so-called trans men. And she noted that there were the beginnings of early programmes for the treatment of children who veered from sex-based stereotypes, and that those were already developing when she wrote the book. Moving on. In her sort of colonisation of women, there was also the invasion of all women-only spaces that they were already achieving, not just feminist conferences and so on. When we move into the second wave, if you like, of the is now called, obviously, the transgender movement, Sheila, she identified the growth of the internet as the means by which transgender activism took off internationally. And the switch from transsexualism to transgenderism was as a result of male cross-dressers wanting to be identified as women for their own sexual gratification. I think from the early 2000s we can see, in terms of what was being written about them, that they engaged in a strategy of what's now called policy capture, to capture all the different agencies, state agencies, to capture international law, to take over these agencies and ensure that they could would change their policies. Really, certainly before the vast majority of us in the UK became very much aware of what was going on. And they were also doing this under the radar. There wasn't a great load of publicity about what they were doing. They were having their quiet meetings behind doors with policymakers, and in terms of the UK, with lobbying of government departments, politicians. I mean, look, they've taken over the Labour Party, the police, the NHS, schools, local authorities, the BBC, students' unions, trade unions, charities and voluntary organisations, and training staff in these institutions. And by the year 2010, when I became probably first seriously aware of how much they'd already taken over, because I joined the London Feminist Network, only to find, and I volunteered to be a steward on the march, the Reclaim the Night march, that there was a man dressed as a woman as one of the stewards, and that men were actually allowed into the Women's Feminist Network, which was pretty shocking to me at the time. So by that time, I would say by 2010, when we became aware of all this, a lot of it was too late. It had all been put in place. They had achieved the Gender Recognition Act, where women would never, even thought about being consulted. They had achieved all these policy changes, and it was like, these are our rights. You just have to put up with them. And that they did it mostly before the development of social media, particularly organisations like Twitter and so on. And it was only after that they released what could we call their stormtroopers, the really aggressive trans activists that we all know about, and we all know what they've done and what they're still doing. before that they were sort of nice, mild-mannered men, or presenting themselves as that. So in terms of, I mean, I'm not going to go into what they've been doing since, because I think that's all much more public, and it's what we know about it. But it's this idea of men working behind the scenes business and doing it without us really noticing that they're doing it. I just want to say, in terms of what they've done in that sphere, is that the connections and the interconnections between pornography, for example, the porn culture, the sexual abuse of girls, and so on. And we're really at a sort of absolute crisis now, because the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is also totally biased towards trans, it's not a neutral, what it ought to be, which is a neutral body for interpreting the law. They always interpret the law in the favour of the trans movement. Has published, or it probably hasn't published it, it's been found out, again behind the scenes, because someone has leaked it, but has leaked it to radical feminists, that the Human Rights Commission is proposing that in the new law, education law, which is going to be enforced in 2020, that is going to be compulsory, and it's called relationships education. And I'm sure you've seen, stuff in the papers about it. But most of the resistance to it has been about being lesbian and gay. But one of the clever things that these men who are in charge of the trans movement did was to hitch, and Jess has already mentioned this, to hitch trans rights onto lesbian and gay rights, and to say that they're similar. So, for example, they've made transphobia an equivalent to homophobia, and in the list of phobias, same-sex attraction, which Janice Raymond already has pointed out, in the elevation of gender and gender identity, has become same gender attraction. And that's how Stonewall, for example, defines how Stonewall defines being lesbian or gay. You're attracted to a gender, you're not attracted to a same sex. And the other thing that they've done is, as everyone knows, produce these international guidelines called the Yogyakarta Principles, and I think one of the best campaigns that is developing is the Women's Human Rights Campaign and the Sex-Based Declaration on Human Rights. Just in terms of going back to what I was saying about this education and the compulsory education of lesbian, gay and transgender rights in schools under relationship education, which is going to be taught to kids from 5 years old, and it's going to be statutory as opposed to non-statutory guidance. What the EHRC biased take on this is that what schools should be doing, and this goes against their previous advice, allow all schools now, if this becomes law, allow boys into girls' toilets and changing rooms and so on. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that they should happen, as well as teaching all children that you can basically change your gender if you are unhappy with the sex-based stereotypes that you don't want to fit into. So that's basically one of the most serious things about this new draft guidance that's coming out from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and that has to be challenged. So, I mean, it should be quite all over the feminist groups in the internet. So, if you get a chance, write your own letters to them and to... well, it's hard to know who to write to in the government now, because there's one very weak Minister for Women called Victoria somebody.
Baroness Williams.
Baroness Williams, okay. Baroness Williams in the Lords.
Because Liz Truss, isn't it? Is the...
Yes. I'd just like to move a bit onto strategies, the use of our strategies in this sort of extreme... I mean, it's not just Brexit that's an extreme crisis. What is happening to women and girls in particular is an extreme crisis. And if we let it continue in the way it's going, we will have, I've got 2 granddaughters, we will have a whole generation of girls who come up thinking they're born with a gender and not with a sex. We won't have any lesbians anymore. All these are all absolute emergencies, particularly for girls, I would say. And so, this is really a priority that we have to make. There was a girl in the Sunday Times, a girl was told, already there are a lot of schools with so-called gender-neutral toilets, blah, blah, and allowing boys to be in, for example, girls' gym classes. A girl who complained to, I think it was initially her grandmother, who then went and complained to the school about a boy playing with his penis while he was watching her undress. This is an 11-year-old girl. Was told by the teaching staff in the school, well, your granddaughter has to be re-educated. He is a girl. He says he's a girl, and she has to be re-educated to see him as a girl. It is her fault, not his. It isn't. Instead of calling the police because he's committed a criminal offence of voyeurism and indecent exposure, they're turning on the female pupils and saying it is their fault. So that's the situation that's going to get far, far worse in schools if we can't hit it on the head. We can have time for questions. I just wanted to say a bit about how we organise as radical feminists. And in a way, I think because we're quite anarchistic in the way we organise against the trans movement, and what we do. I mean, we do lots of direct action and things. We don't often, and often it's only the Lesbian Rights Alliance that does this. We don't often write direct open letters to ministers and so on. And we don't often actually confront the powerful organisations that are actually speaking to teachers in schools, speaking to MPs about what they're actually doing, and actually confronting these groups directly. Speaking to the police, for example, I think we should be going to the head bods of the police force about the whole thing, about how they've adopted transgender ideology wholesale, so that they're recording men who dress up as women, as female, etc., etc. Okay, I'll stop there.